The humid air clung heavily to the morning at Fort Branton as Colonel Reid Jorlan stepped onto the tarmac, the rhythmic thud of recruit boots echoing in the distance. His gaze moved over the rows of young men jogging in formation, bodies tense, sweat-soaked, disciplined. But his attention shifted sharply when he noticed someone who didn't belong. A silver-haired man stood alone by the chain-link fence, one boot crossed casually over the other, a weathered duffel resting at his feet like it had carried more years than miles. The man didn't blend in. He didn't try to. His leather jacket looked older than half the recruits on base, cracked at the seams, the color faded by sun and storms. Yet he stood with a quiet steadiness that suggested purpose, not confusion. When Sergeant Merrin approached him, clipboard in hand, the stranger didn't move. He simply lifted his head and said, in a voice rough but controlled, "Call me Finch." His tone wasn't defensive or shy. It was factual, the kind of tone men used when they had nothing left to prove. Merrin, taken off guard, hesitated a second longer than he meant to. "You got clearance to be here?" he asked, trying to sound firm. Finch's eyes drifted across the runway, as if measuring distances only he understood. "I came to watch the flight simulations," Finch replied with calm certainty. Sergeant Merrin blinked. Nobody watched simulations except authorized personnel, and even they needed layers of paperwork. Merrin shot a quick glance toward Colonel Jorlan, silently asking for backup. Jorlan approached with the kind of authority that made men straighten instinctively. His boots hit the pavement with sharp precision as he stopped inches from Finch. The colonel's expression was carved in stone, his patience non-existent. "We don't give tours to strangers," he said flatly. Finch didn't shift, didn't shrug, didn't even blink. His gaze stayed calm, almost detached. "Didn't come for a tour," he murmured. Then his voice lowered, gaining a weight that cut through the humid air. "I used to fly here, back when the sky still respected its pilots." The line was delivered softly, yet its echo felt loud. Merrin's grip tightened on his clipboard. Jorlan's eyebrow twitched upward before he let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Right," he said, eyes scanning Finch from the silver strand of hair down to his battered boots. "Let me guess, you're the legendary pilot who saved a town, wrestled a storm, and vanished into the mountains?" Finch's answer was only the slightest lift of an eyebrow. "No pride, no denial." Just a man letting another man talk himself into disbelief. Jorlan folded his arms across his chest. "So what's your story?" Finch's gaze drifted to the hangars, those steel giants standing silent under the morning haze. His jaw tightened, a small, nearly invisible motion. Then he spoke with a calm finality that shifted the air around them. "Not quite. I flew Hawk 8. The reaction was immediate and unsettling." Sergeant Merrin's face drained of color, his breath catching in his throat. Jorlan narrowed his eyes, trying to read the stranger's expression. The mention of Hawk 8 was not casual. It was not common. It was a locked vault name spoken only in places without microphones. Hawk 8 was decommissioned after a classified mission 15 years ago, Jorlan said slowly, his voice losing its earlier mockery. "Only 2 pilots survived that mess, and one of them's buried in Asheville." Finch did not argue, did not defend, did not elaborate. He let the silence stretch between them until it felt like another presence standing on the tarmac. Finally, he spoke, not to convince them, but simply to state a truth he no longer cared who believed. He turned his eyes toward the hangars again, the place where rust and memory met, and said in a quiet tone that carried more weight than a shout, "Then I must be the other one." The moment Colonel Jorlan shut the operations office door, the atmosphere tightened like a wire pulled to its limit. Finch stood in the center of the room, hands loosely at his sides, while 3 officers circled around him as if he were an artifact pulled from the ruins of a forgotten war. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting pale shadows across his weathered jacket. Jorlan wasted no time. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a metal chair. His voice was firm, clipped, carrying the authority of a man used to immediate obedience. Finch didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He lowered himself onto the chair with the slow, deliberate movements of someone conserving energy for something more important. Sergeant Merrin hurried to the terminal, tapping in code after code, scanning every database he could access. Each search returned the same response: no match found. His forehead tightened with confusion. Sir, nothing. No service record, no facial ID, no enlistment archives. Jorlan crossed his arms, jaw clenched. Strange how a man with no record strolls onto my base and claims he flew a classified aircraft. He leaned closer. So I'll ask again, who are you? Finch didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted to the far wall, where a vintage aerial schematic from an old Hawk-class training series hung in a frame. The map was faded, the ink nearly worn away from decades of sunlight. Yet Finch studied it with the quiet concentration of someone reading a familiar, painful memory. He rose to his feet without permission, walked toward the schematic, and lifted a single finger. That mountain pass, he said softly, tapping the map exactly at the midpoint between two ridges. His voice carried a low resonance, as if pulled from years buried beneath silence. It's narrower than the map shows. The drafts shift every hour. Crosswinds hit you from a northern ridge at 40 knots. Lieutenant Doran, who had memorized every declassified operation the base had ever conducted, stepped forward in disbelief. His breath caught. But that's the cold horizon region. His voice lowered. Sir, this isn't in any current training material. Finch nodded slowly. It wouldn't be, because most of the people who flew that pass never made it through. Jorlan's rigid expression faltered for the first time. Cold horizon, he murmured. That's classified beyond top-level clearance. It never entered the manual drafts. Finch's gaze didn't leave the map. Cost us a wingtip that night, he said. Nearly cost us the whole squad. A thick silence filled the room. Even the hum of machinery seemed to dim under the weight of his words. Doran swallowed hard. How do you know this? That operation, he hesitated. Only a handful of pilots were even aware it existed. Finch finally turned around. The weariness in his eyes settled across his face like a shadow that had followed him for years. Because I was in one of those cockpits, he said, and my co-pilot never made it back. Jorlan stepped forward, his voice sharp again, but now tinged with something else, something close to unease. You expect me to believe you were part of that mission? That you just walked off a classified flight and disappeared into the world? Finch shrugged subtly. Disappearing wasn't the plan. But when the automatic systems failed and Engine 4 started to overheat, someone had to shut it down by hand. He lifted his right hand, flexing the fingers as if remembering the pressure of the switch. That someone was me. Doran exchanged a glance with Merrin. There was no arrogance in Finch's voice, no attempt at heroism. It was simply a man recounting a truth no one had asked him to remember. Jorlan exhaled slowly, but the tension remained. Even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't explain why you're here, why you walked on my base without clearance, or why every system says you don't exist. Finch stepped away from the schematic and faced the colonel fully. His posture straightened, and for the first time, the room felt too small to contain him. Because something is wrong with your Hawk simulation protocols, he said. Someone has been tampering with them. Merrin frowned. Tampering how? Finch's voice dropped to a level that made every man lean in. Altitude readings that stalled too late. Delayed engine response. Faulty wind drift compensations. Small adjustments, almost invisible, but deadly when combined. His eyes sharpened with urgency. If your rookies run drills on those corrupted simulations, they'll climb into their jets with the wrong instincts. And instincts are the only thing keeping a pilot alive when the sky tries to take him. Doran's throat tightened. How do you know all this? Finch met his gaze steadily. Because I saw similar errors once before. A pause. 15 years ago. And good men paid the price. Colonel Jorlan took a step back, processing the layers of implication. There was doubt in his eyes. But there was something else too, an unwelcome awareness that the stranger in front of him might be the only person seeing a danger no one else had noticed. He spoke slowly. So, this is why you came? To warn us? Finch nodded. Not for recognition. Not for nostalgia. And certainly not for a second chance at service. He lifted his chin, voice steady and final. I came because someone's been tampering with Hawk protocol simulations, and if you're training your men with those errors, they'll die before they even take off. It wasn't a boast. It was a warning. The simulator doors slid shut behind Finch with a heavy metallic thud, locking him into a room lit only by the soft hum of overhead panels. Colonel Jorlan stood on the other side of the glass, arms crossed, expression fixed and unreadable. One test, he had said moments earlier, his voice stern and low. You mess it up, you're gone. Those words still echoed faintly in Finch's mind, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what was at stake. He didn't respond then, and he didn't respond now. Instead, he sank into the rigid pilot's seat with a familiarity that shouldn't have been possible for a man who officially didn't exist. The simulation console flickered to life. The controls, old and somewhat unstable, vibrated under his fingertips. For a brief second, Finch remained motionless, silent, still, eyes fixed on the curved glass before him. Then, with a slow inhale, his posture shifted. His shoulders squared, his back straightened, and his hands hovered over the throttle and pitch as though guided by an instinct older than the machine itself. It wasn't confidence. It was certainty, a man returning to the language he once spoke fluently. Colonel Jorlan watched, leaning slightly toward the glass. The colonel had seen hundreds of pilots enter that simulator. None had moved like this. The opening scene of the simulation rendered in a sudden burst of static before stabilizing. Mission firelock. A mission sealed in classified silence for 15 years. Terrain scanned across the screen, snow-blue valleys, jagged cliffs, burning pockets of crosswind that had ended stronger pilots than most remembered. The system reported multiple glitches in the wind drift algorithm. Finch didn't wait for prompts. His fingers danced across manual recalibration switches, adjusting wind vectors by memory alone. Inside the observation room, Lieutenant Dorn muttered, "He shouldn't know those inputs." Jorlan didn't answer. His jaw tightened. Finch eased the Hawk simulation into the first maneuver. The engines vibrated with artificial turbulence, but he guided the aircraft with small, precise adjustments. Each movement carried the quiet weight of experience. No hesitation, no wasted effort. As the simulation progressed, the difficulty increased. Heat flares erupted near the starboard side. Target indicators blinked red. Yet Finch's breathing remained steady, almost meditative. At the 20-minute mark, the system emitted a warning tone. The weather pattern, already glitched, shifted unpredictably, sending the aircraft toward a crosswind strong enough to destabilize the simulation for an average pilot. Finch's fingers tightened around the throttle, but only slightly. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes as the Hawk dipped into the thermal pocket. "Does he know it's misaligned?" Dorn whispered. "He hasn't missed it," Jorlan said, though his voice held more surprise than certainty. Finch adjusted the pitch manually, countering the incorrect drift calculation with a movement so subtle it barely registered on the telemetry graph. The aircraft righted itself. The colonel blinked. Most pilots would have crashed. Finch made it look like routine maintenance. But the real test came at the 42-minute mark. Without warning, a flare pocket ignited ahead, a blinding sphere of unstable upward heat that should have forced a retreat. Instead, Finch's hand tightened around the control stick. His breathing slowed. For a moment, the entire simulator room felt suspended in a fragile silence. Then Finch inverted the Hawk. The aircraft flipped upside down, slicing through the rising thermal flare with a maneuver the simulation immediately flagged as aerodynamically impossible. Alarm tones screamed across the control board. Finch ignored them. With a steady hand, he rolled the aircraft through the heat bloom, maintaining perfect alignment. The motion was fluid, elegant, almost balletic, the product of a pilot who had once flown on instinct rather than instruction. Inside the observation room, Dorn stepped back. "That move isn't in any manual." "No," Jorlan replied softly, eyes locked on the screen. "It isn't." Finch completed the sequence with surgical precision, cutting through the last stretch of the mission as though retracing steps he had walked 1,000 times. When the simulation finally shifted to the landing phase, he brought the Hawk down smoothly, not a single casualty flagged, Not a single error marker except the one the AI itself didn't understand. The room went silent. Finch rose from the simulator seat with a calmness that felt heavier than pride. He didn't look at the glass. He didn't look at the data screen flashing behind him. He simply stepped forward, the quiet hum of the system fading behind him as he waited for Jorlan to come inside. Colonel Jorlan entered slowly, gripping a printed telemetry sheet in one hand. His eyes scanned the readings for the 5th time, unable to make sense of them. "The AI marked your maneuver as unknown," he said, his voice tight. Finch finally met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "I filed that maneuver under Red Talon 42, he said quietly. "But no one logged it because the man who saw it died before he could write it down." He paused, letting the silence settle. Then he added, with a weight that made Jorlan swallow hard, "Now tell me again, how do your pilots train for something the system can't recognize?" The roar of the twin engines hit Finch the moment the hangar door slid open. The Hawk-class jet towered before him, its matte gray frame catching the last streaks of orange sunlight that spilled through the open structure. There was no ceremony, no introductions, only the quiet hum of ground crews checking final readings. Colonel Jorlan stood near the nose of the aircraft, arms crossed, expression unreadable as he watched Finch approach. The moment felt heavier than the briefing had implied. This wasn't a test flight, it was a verdict. Lieutenant Rourke was already in the cockpit, tapping impatient fingers along the side panel. He glanced down when Finch climbed the ladder, offering a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hope you don't pass out mid-loop," Rourke said, voice crisp but laced with doubt. He tried to sound casual, but Finch caught the stiffness in his jaw, the attempt to disguise nerves with arrogance. Finch didn't reply. He simply slid into the co-pilot's seat, fastening the straps with the slow confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. The canopy sealed shut with a hydraulic hiss, wrapping them in a cocoon of metal and tense silence. The moment the jet taxied onto the runway, Finch felt the familiar tremor beneath his boots, the subtle vibration pattern of the Hawk's engines, something no newer aircraft replicated. Taking off in 10, Rourke announced, hands moving across the controls with clean, practiced motions. The jet surged forward, lifting into the open sky as the base shrank beneath them. At first, everything unfolded according to protocol. Rourke executed a set of standard maneuvers, banking left and rolling into formation paths programmed into the test flight route. Finch watched without comment, eyes tracking cloud patterns, subtle shifts in wind vectors, and how the Hawk responded under Rourke's command. The younger pilot was skilled, no doubt, but he flew with the precision of a manual, not the instinct of someone who understood the aircraft's soul. Then the turbulence hit. A sudden crosswind punched the jet from below, jerking it off its designated path. Rourke's eyes widened. "That wasn't forecasted," he muttered, gripping the controls tighter as the Hawk shuddered. The onboard system lagged by half a second, failing to compensate for the abrupt draft. Finch leaned forward, voice calm. "Ease off your right stabilizer. You're fighting the wind instead of redirecting it." Rourke hesitated, then the turbulence struck again, harder. Finch didn't wait. His hands moved with uncanny speed, adjusting the air intake manually, something few pilots bother with anymore. The jet steadied, slicing through the unstable air pocket with surprising grace. Rourke stared at the readings. "How did you know the intake would counter that shift?" Finch answered without looking at him. "Because the Hawk talks before it falls. You just have to listen." For a moment, neither spoke. Rourke guided them toward the test drones hovering in a circular pattern ahead, forming a smoke ring meant to evaluate precision under pressure. "You handle the diagnostics," Rourke said, trying to regain authority. But Finch saw the sweat gathering near his hairline. As they neared the drones, a warning light blinked, faulty altitude reader. Rourke cursed under his breath, tapping the screen. "It's giving false dips. We'll have to abort." "No," Finch said firmly. His hand moved across the outdated mechanical override, bypassing the glitch with a series of deliberate motions. "Trust the horizon line, not the machine." Rourke swallowed, unsure whether to argue or comply, but the margin for debate vanished as the smoke ring closed in. Finch took partial control, guiding the Hawk into a narrow threaded pass, angling the wings just enough to slip through without tripping a single proximity alarm. The jet glided through the smoke as cleanly as a blade through water. When they emerged on the other side, silence filled the cockpit, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had. They circled back toward Fort Branton, the base lights flickering like scattered embers below. Rourke's breathing was slow now, almost reverent, as if he were processing a truth he wasn't prepared for. When they landed, the ground crew rushed in, but stayed back when they saw the expressions on both men's faces. Colonel Jorlan stepped forward. "What did he do?" he asked, searching Rourke's eyes for answers. Rourke removed his helmet slowly, the bravado gone, replaced with something close to awe. His voice was soft, but it carried across the hangar with the weight of a verdict. He didn't fly the Hawk, he became it. The alarm first appeared on Colonel Jorlan's terminal as a crimson blinking icon, unauthorized access flagged, followed by a line of encrypted data that scrolled too fast to read. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence of his dim office like a blade. He leaned forward, the glow of the monitor reflecting off his stern features, and opened the flag report. It led straight to a classified folder, Cold Horizon/Hawk8/archive. His jaw tightened. No one had touched those files in years. He opened the attached image. A grainy photograph filled the screen, dusk light, rough shadows, two men standing beside the towering frame of Hawk 8. One man had a square jaw, a heavy brow, and the tired but sharp eyes of someone who had gone far beyond the limits of training. Jorlan exhaled slowly. It was Finch, younger, but unmistakably the same man who had walked onto his base days ago. The second man was Captain Merrick Doran, recorded as killed in action during the same mission. Two survivors had been listed. One buried, the other vanished. Until now. A knock sounded at the door. Lieutenant Doran stepped in, tablet in hand, his voice tight. "Sir, we found something else. There'd been a breach in the simulation server." Jorlan stood immediately. "Show me." They moved down the hall toward the tech wing. Rows of monitors cast shifting light across the darkened room where Sergeant Kellen, the systems officer, sat rigid at his station. "Colonel," Kellen said, swiveling his chair, "someone modified the Hawk protocols. It's subtle, altitude thresholds off by less than 1%, delayed engine response values small enough to pass casual inspection, lethal enough to misguide training flights." Jorlan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Who accessed the files?" Kellen highlighted the trace signature. "It's routed through a civilian contractor's terminal. Maris Corps." Before Jorlan could respond, the door behind them opened. Finch stepped inside, his face unreadable, his boots silent on the tiles. He held something between two fingers, a small black flash drive. "I already know what you're looking at," Finch said quietly. Jorlan turned sharply. "You knew about this breach?" Finch nodded once. 6 months ago, I intercepted fragments of altered protocol data coming through a civilian update channel. Someone was rewriting Hawk simulations in ways that would get your pilots killed. I didn't trust sending it through the usual channels, not with the clearance levels being shuffled around. His tone carried neither boast nor fear, just tired certainty. "So I came myself." Jorlan stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "Why not report it then? Why disappear for 15 years and walk back in only now?" Finch met his eyes. "Because I knew you wouldn't believe a man who came back from a mission no one wants to talk about." He handed over the flash drive. Jorlan hesitated before taking it, sensing the weight of what might be inside. Finch continued, his expression darkening as if replaying something painful. "Everything on that drive points to the same source: altered logs, corrupted protocols, and timestamps. The signature belongs to Maris Corps, a man with no cockpit hours, no flight background, and a history of false records hidden under contractor paperwork." Doran swallowed hard. "Sir, if those corrupted settings made it into the live rotation, our next training squad could lose a jet before they even understand what failed." Finch stepped closer to the main screen. "I watched a squad go down once because a system failed. I won't let it happen again." Not while I can still stand. The room went still. Jorlan stared at Finch, at the man who had been labeled a ghost. A myth, a question that no one ever solved. But here he was, offering proof, warnings, and a past that refused to stay buried. "What are you really after, Finch?" Jorlan finally asked, though his voice was softer now, almost wary. Finch didn't hesitate. He spoke with the quiet conviction of someone who had lived too long in the shadows of regret. "I didn't come back for nostalgia," he said. His eyes shifted to the dark window overlooking the hangars, where jets rested under cold lights. "I came back to stop someone from getting your men killed." Merrin's Corps was arrested 2 days later, dragged into the dim interrogation room with his wrists trembling and his eyes darting around like a man already cornered. The moment he sat, he broke. There was no bravado, no attempt to negotiate. He confessed in a strained whisper, his voice cracking as he admitted that he had deliberately introduced the data faults into the Hawk simulation protocols. He claimed he wanted to test AI correction under stress, but even he knew the justification sounded hollow. The overhead light flickered across his pale face as he spoke, making the room feel colder. Colonel Jorlan listened silently, jaw locked tight, his expression darkening with every word. Each sentence from Corps felt like another blow, a reminder of how dangerously close his pilots had come to training for death rather than survival. Jorlan stepped out into the corridor, boots echoing sharply on the concrete floor. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had trusted the simulation system, trusted the files, trusted the people maintaining them. Now he saw how thin that trust truly was. He ordered a full rollback of the corrupted files immediately, his voice firm yet controlled, though the tension beneath it was unmistakable. Technicians scrambled to comply, their fingers racing across keyboards as alerts flashed across multiple screens. For a moment, the operations center felt like a battlefield, silent, urgent, bracing for what might have been. Meanwhile, Finch stood quietly at the far end of the hangar, arms folded, watching the recruits run drills in the morning heat. He didn't call out corrections or offer advice. He simply observed, eyes narrowed with the unmistakable understanding of a man who had seen what rushed training and flawed systems could cost. When Jorlan approached him, the colonel's steps slowed. For the first time since the old pilot had arrived, Jorlan seemed less like a commanding officer and more like a man searching for clarity. "We verified everything," Jorlan said, stopping at Finch's side. "Your logs, your maneuver records, even the old Hawk 8 archives." His voice carried a surprising mixture of respect and regret. "You were telling the truth from the start." Finch didn't turn his head. "Truth doesn't change depending on who believes it," he replied softly, his gaze still on the recruits. The words were calm, but there was a quiet ache beneath them, a heaviness shaped by years of silence. Jorlan offered him an official reinstatement, the kind of opportunity pilots dreamed of. But Finch shook his head gently. "Not here for stripes," he said, tapping the toe of his worn boot against the ground. "These kids don't need a relic in uniform. They need pilots who know what the sky asks of them." The colonel exhaled slowly, nodding. "I misjudged you," he admitted, his voice low. "I saw an old man in worn boots. Not the reason some of us still have flight manuals." Finch gave a small, tired smile, the kind that belonged to someone who had carried too many memories for too long. "I earned the boots first," he said. Jorlan walked with him across the hangar toward the transport shuttle waiting to depart. The engines hummed softly, a reminder of departures both literal and symbolic. Finch paused at the ramp, placing one hand on the cold metal railing. He looked back at the base, not with bitterness, but with something closer to quiet responsibility. Hawk 8 was never just a plane, Finch said, his voice steady enough to carry over the engine noise. It was a promise. Don't let your rookies forget what it cost to fly it right. Jorlan lifted his chin, absorbing the weight of the words. He didn't answer with a salute or a command, just a firm nod, the kind exchange between men who understood what they could never fully explain. As Finch boarded the transport, the sunlight framed him in a pale glow. For a moment, he looked like a ghost stepping back into the world he had once left behind. The engines roared, dust scattered across the hangar entrance, and the silhouette of the forgotten pilot slowly faded into the bright horizon. He wasn't just another washed-up vet. He was the last pilot who flew the impossible and survived.